And this gets to like the security issue. So in security, there's different ways of, we talked about strategy. Now let's talk about security. There's different mental models on what security means and what a secure system is versus a non-secure system. And for the longest time, people frame security as they use this linear causality model, meaning like accidents or security breaches happen because of a linear chain of events. Something breaks that leads to something else breaking, that leads to something else breaking. And that's the reason why we have security flaws. Linear chain event causality model. But that's not really, it doesn't really hold. It's not really an effective security model, a way of viewing security, because most of the time in the real world, the things are not happening independently. So like linear causality means you have to assume that this security flaw happened independently of another security flaw happened. And so people design systems that have like interlocks or redundancy, thinking that the reason why security flaws happen is because of a sequential chain of independent events that led to a security breach or a catastrophe. So example, Titanic. Why did Titanic sink? What was the security flaw or the safety flaw that caused the Titanic to sink?
I don't know the specific one. It wasn't iceberg proof.
Yeah. So if you view security as a linear causality thing, like as a linear chain of events, then you might say it was a fluke. What are the probability that all these different bad luck things would have just aligned up perfectly to the point where it sinks? So, for example, there happened to be an iceberg in the way, or for example, that the different interlocked pieces of the hull happened to fill up with water or happened to flood in just the right way, hit it just the right way. Or what is the probability that it didn't have the lifeboats that it needed? Or what's the probability that the watchman didn't have binoculars? And so, oh man, as a result of these low probability events all adding up together, we get this infinitesimally low probability that the Titanic would sink, and that's why it happened. But that's bullcrap, because those were not independent events. The reason why the watchman agreed to go on the ship without binoculars, the reason why it didn't have enough lifeboats, the reason why the crew didn't practice escaping the ship, the reason why the captain was trying to set an Atlantic speed record, the reason why he ignored the warning that there's icebergs in the water, the reason why the dude that is supposed to radio was asleep, the reason is because they're all mutually correlated to the fact that they didn't believe that it could sink. That for the last 5 years, the White Star Line advertised this thing as an unsinkable ship. So they were all mutually correlated to the fact that none of them thought it could sink. And by that reason, those events were not independent.
Wow.
And that happens all the time. Like all the time, people try to design redundancies into things, assuming that the reason why security breaches happen is because of the linear chain of events, of independent events. And it's almost never true. So, okay, that doesn't work. So what's another way, another model to approaching security or safety? And I know you're going to appreciate this one. I know you're going to know some flaws with this model. It's called the epistemological model. Used in medicine a lot, particularly the transfer of pandemics, how to protect people against pandemics. So at least in the epistemological model, people understand that the results of security breaches or crisis or loss events isn't the result of a bunch of independent linear events happening in a sequence. They at least recognize that there is complexity involved, that there's these different variables that interact with each other in some complex way that result in a loss event at an emergent scale. And that that emergence is more than the sum of all the independent variables that contributed to the loss event or the pandemic or whatever you're trying to secure against. Okay. So how do you protect against that? Well, you have to go out and you have to just measure as much as possible. Just take as much data on as much random variables as you possibly can and run the numbers and see if you can back out what those relationships between the variables are that are leading to the emergent crisis at scale. So what are the factors that are contributing to this COVID thing just wrecking people or any other disease, right? So it's slightly, I guess, more effective than linear causality approach to security, but there's also very glaring flaws with that too that are also present with linear. And that is like, what data are you collecting? And by the way, you're only able to measure the variables that you can measure. That's the big flaw of epistemological approaches, is you're only deriving correlations between variables that you can measure, not that might actually be the leading cause of the pandemic or whatever you're trying to protect against. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there can be variables that you're just not aware of or that are not
that you
measurable.
Literally can't measure. Yeah. There could be leading root cause variables that you cannot measure. So your ability to defend against a pandemic or against this or that is only the result of the things that you can measure, not the result of what might actually be the leading cause of the disaster.
Right. And an enemy you cannot see, you cannot fight, something like that.
Yeah. So you get into a problem there. And that's where you get like what we've seen with COVID is just the glaring flaws. And I don't have, one political opinion either way, but I do know the flaws of epistemological approaches to security. And the flaw is you're only as effective as what you can measure. And that's only as effective as the data that you're gathering. And that's going to be constantly changing. So like the criticism is like, oh, the science changed. What do you know? Something. And it's like, yeah, it's because, the data and what you're collecting and the correlations that you can make between those variables is changing. And what's frustrating is when scientists act like that's what science is, like, because that's quantifiable, that is truth versus not. And it's like, no,
right.
You're making very false correlations there, especially when it comes to security, because remember, in security is a totally trans-scientific issue. It's beyond what can be quantified. It's beyond what can be measured. How do you measure a design flaw? Okay. Also, by the way, a lot of security comes down to frustratingly qualitative variables such as ethics, such as morals. So maybe let's assume it is true that you've measured the proper stuff. You happen to have determined the root cause. Is the solution ethical? That is the trans-scientific question. And so when you're trying to evaluate the security of anything, whether it be a new emerging technology for warfare, whether it be how to defend against a pandemic, whether it be how to prevent a Titanic from sinking, you have to factor in more. You have to look at the systemic structure as a whole and factor in not just probabilities, but also qualitative metrics, ethical concerns, design concerns. Was it ethical for the United States to build the atomic bomb? It's a trans scientific question. It's posed as if it could be answered Booleanly, like yes or no, but it can't. It depends on your approach to morals, your approach to ethics. This will be true for any technology, to include Bitcoin. Is it secure? Is it ethical? Is it the right thing to do? Is it the wrong thing to do? No one can purely know. It's an unquantifiable thing. And the role of the scientist and the engineer is to be honest about that and make it very clear where something stops being science and starts being trans science, and not to conflate accidentally or unfortunately deliberately often the difference between real science, real engineering versus something that's beyond it.
And this has dropped us into the domain. I think it was David Hume that posed this question, like, can you derive an ought from an is? Right? Science is telling us what is, it's descriptive, but it can't necessarily, in the realm of human action, it cannot be prescriptive necessarily, to your point. Like, is the nuclear bomb ethical? I don't say, like, your gut instinct would be no. But then look what it's done. It's created this global peace stalemate.
Yeah, we haven't had a peer-to-peer grand scale war since nukes.
Yeah, that presumably led us to Bitcoin, right? Led us to, as you said earlier, DARPA, TCP/IP, internet, Bitcoin.